What if I told you that the USA has the capacity to build a moon base right now and very cheaply on top? You would say that I'm exaggerating, right? You would say that yes, the US is planning to land on the moon with its Artemis program, in which a lunar landing with humans on board is planned for later in this decade, where a SpaceX human landing system will land several American astronauts on the moon as part of the Artemis 3 mission. But that approach is super complex and cumbersome. What if there was a cheaper and faster way to do this with almost entirely existing hardware? For the Artemis 3 moon landing, we will need to launch a SpaceX Starship human landing system, which isn't even nearly ready yet, and then we'll have to refuel it in Earth orbit with at least 6 separate Starship launches. The Starship human landing system will then be sent into an orbit around the moon. Then, the Space Launch System rocket, in short SLS, will be launched separately with the Orion capsule, with the astronauts themselves on board. The entire SLS rocket is then thrown away. Then the Orion capsule flies to the moon, and in moon orbit, it will then dock with the previously sent SpaceX Starship. Then the astronauts transfer onto the Starship lander, land on the moon, stay there for probably at least a week, then afterwards return to moon orbit, and then dock again with Orion. Starship will remain in lunar orbit while Orion flies back to Earth. The capsule then enters Earth's atmosphere and the astronauts land safely back on Earth. If that whole approach sounds super complicated and cumbersome to you, it's because it is. And it is also very expensive because most of the hardware is being discarded. But it also needs hardware that is by far not finished yet. I'm talking about the Starship Moonlander. It will take several more years until it is even nearly ready for landing humans on the moon. It needs to undergo a lot of testing before that moment will arrive, and Starship will need to fly reliably for a few years. SpaceX will need to demonstrate that the Starship lander can land safely on the moon in an unmanned demonstration landing and that orbital refueling works. Because especially orbital refueling is quintessential for a Starship HLS moon landing, as I explained before. So you can already see that the whole approach is very costly, very complex, and will depend 100% on when the SpaceX Starship will be ready and will be able to fly repeatedly in a reliable manner. But what if there were a way to land on the moon right now with existing hardware, or let's say almost existing hardware, needing just minor additions and minor modifications? This plan would look as follows. First, we would employ the Falcon Heavy. This is an existing heavy lift rocket by SpaceX, which is partially reusable and which has flown very reliably 10 times already without incidents. This rocket has an impressively high payload capacity of almost 64 metric tons to low Earth orbit, but, and that is the important point here, it would be powerful enough to be able to deliver somewhere between 8 and 10 metric tons to the surface of the moon in its expendable configuration, meaning that the Falcon Heavy would not be reused but discarded. 8 to 10 metric tons is already not bad, considering that the Apollo lunar module didn't weigh so much more. It weighed around 15 metric tons, fully fueled up in its base configuration. So the Falcon Heavy could deliver some serious cargo to the moon. Now imagine we carry out 2 Falcon Heavy launches. The first will land us equipment for a propellant production site, complete with solar panels, communication, maybe a small rover, and the fuel production unit itself. The second Falcon Heavy would land us a nice habitat module in which the astronauts themselves would live and work, and which will include food, tools, research equipment, extra spacesuits, and so on and so forth. Of course, we might add a third launch of a Falcon Heavy if we would want a larger base from the get-go, because an 8 metric ton weighing habitat shelter will not be very large, so having 2 of those shelters from the beginning might be a good idea. After the base and propellant production has been set up, another Falcon Heavy launch would bring a lunar lander into orbit, together with a fully fueled up moon lander and an attached propulsion stage. Then it would be time to launch the first moon astronauts. This would happen in a Falcon 9 rocket, which would bring up the moon astronauts to orbit in a Crew Dragon capsule. It would then dock with the moon lander and its attached propulsion stage, and the Dragon would stay behind in Earth orbit, while the astronauts would fly to the moon in the lander and the attached propulsion stage. The propulsion stage would be shed after arriving at moon orbit because it would be empty, since it used up all the fuel for the acceleration burn to the moon and for the deceleration burn into moon orbit. And then the astronauts would descend to the moon base with the moon lander. They would then stay at the base and of course immediately start with the production of propellant. The beautiful thing on the moon is that there is a lot of water ice at the lunar south pole. The existence of water ice there is amazing because basically you can use it for everything. You can drink it, obviously, but with electrolysis you can split water into hydrogen and oxygen. The oxygen you can use for breathing, but in addition to that, you now basically have your rocket fuel. Because the engines of the moon lander would of course run on liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, which, as we said, you can obtain from water ice on the moon. So the astronauts would create their own return propellant on site. After the astronauts have stayed a while on the moon and explored and created the liquid oxygen and hydrogen and refueled the moon lander, then they would return to moon orbit. From there, they would initiate the so-called trans-Earth injection burn, which would bring them back to Earth and then decelerate until they would reach a stable Earth orbit. This entire maneuver would of course use up all their fuel. They would of course, however, rendezvous with the Crew Dragon, which was left behind in Earth orbit before. The astronauts would transfer onto Crew Dragon and then safely return back to Earth, while the moon lander would remain in orbit waiting for the next crew. Now all that would be needed would be further expendable Falcon 9 launches, which would bring a new crew in a Crew Dragon capsule to the moon lander in Earth orbit, in addition to fuel for refueling the moon lander. The Falcon 9 would be expendable because that would allow to push the mass that can be delivered to low Earth orbit to 23 metric tons. Enough for Crew Dragon plus fuel for the moon lander. And then the whole process could be repeated as often as needed. The moon base could be made larger and larger by subsequent Falcon Heavy launches. In its most simple form, the total cost for this whole undertaking is impressively low. 3 Falcon Heavy expendable launches plus a regular Falcon 9 and a Falcon 9 expendable launch would bring you to around $600 million. Add the cost of the base modules and propellant production side of another few hundred million, and let's say we're at $1 billion. All this hardware exists already. For instance, the Thales Alenia Space Multiple Purpose Habitat Module would be cheap and would also not weigh more than the aforementioned 8 to 10 metric ton weight limit. Now the only thing needed, which we currently don't have, would be a small moon lander, which would probably be the most expensive piece of hardware, as it currently doesn't exist. Depending on who would develop it, it will probably cost a few $1 billion. So therefore, setting up the initial moon base would be $1 billion, plus a few billion more for the moon lander. But remember that after this initial cost, all the hardware could be reused, the moon lander as well. And so the only recurring costs afterwards would be Falcon 9 expendable launches, which cost about $70 million each. So in the beginning you would have to pay a few $billion up front for the moon base and for the lander, but after that, the recurring costs would be only $70 million per mission. That is really cheap. Now compare that to the Artemis program, where the recurring costs would be every single launch over $1 billion, because that is how much one SLS launch actually costs. If we, however, add the development costs for the SLS rocket, for the Orion capsule, and the SpaceX Starship, and then the moon base itself, we are talking tens of billions of dollars upfront cost as compared to only billions. So the Falcon Heavy and Falcon 9 moon base plan would reduce the total costs by a factor of 10. And the only thing missing would be the moon lander itself, which could be developed relatively fast. This interesting idea was brought forth a few years ago by Dr. Robert Zubrin, who is famous for his human Mars landing ideas, but as we can see, he also has excellent ideas for the human exploration of the moon. I personally like the plan very much, and it would be certainly doable in an easy and fast way, and it would be not as complex as the current NASA Artemis mission design. But of course, we have to be realistic. The chances that NASA will do this are very low. US Congress wants to use SLS because it's basically a job creation machine at this point, and bypassing that system, unfortunately, will be vetoed by US Congress. It's not by chance that the SLS is sometimes called the Senate Launch System. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like and subscribe, because we'll continue making lots of videos on the fascinating developments in human spaceflight. And please consider supporting us on Patreon or via a YouTube membership, because this would allow us to make many more and even better videos. Thank you very much in advance. Thanks for watching, all the best, and see you next time.